Welcome. Today, this session is about social mobility awareness and measurement. So the aims of this session today are to look into what is social mobility, why are we talking about socio-economic diversity, what is that, and for us to look at potentially what you can do around this area of your diversity and inclusion practice. How do you measure it? What data should you be looking at to try and determine whether what you're doing is working? And to share some realistic and practical ideas that you can take back to your organisation around what you can make a start on doing to improve social mobility, no matter whether you're a small organisation or a large organisation, and no matter where you are on the maturity curve of your practice around social mobility and socio-economic diversity. I am really, really delighted today to be speaking to Sarah Atkinson, who is the CEO of the Social Mobility Foundation. I'm really excited to talk to her. Sarah, I would love to ask you to introduce yourself and the Social Mobility Foundation, and I'd love you to just give us a bit of a view of why is social mobility important? Why are we here talking about this? Just give me a bit of a view of that from Social Mobility Foundation's point of view.
Thank you, Lexi, and thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation, which is something that I and we at SMF are enormously passionate about, as you would guess from the name. So the SMF, we're a charity. Our whole mission is about creating opportunities for young people who are held back, not because they lack talent and ambition, they don't, but because of structural barriers that are associated with their family background, the kind of jobs their parents do, the kind of schools that they go to, the kind of parts of the country they grow up in. They have lots of potential, which we want to unlock and support. And we do that in three ways. We run programs for young people to connect them with opportunities, to build their knowledge, their networks, their confidence, help them understand career pathways and gain access. We work with employers. We run something called the Social Mobility Employer Index, which is about helping employers to understand what they can do to identify and break down barriers and to create more opportunities, more meaningful opportunities for people to get in and get on in their organisations. And we campaign and advocate for social mobility because we want everyone to understand why this matters so much, how it's holding us back as a country, and what it is that we want everyone to understand and be able to do to support social mobility. And why we think it's important, it shouldn't be, and I think everyone instinctively feels it shouldn't be, the case that the things that define your career outcomes are more about where you grow up, what kind of jobs your parents did, what kind of school you go to, than they are about how hard you work, how talented you are, or your skills and potential. But unfortunately, in the UK, in every economy, actually in the developed world, there's a really strong connection between your socioeconomic background, the environment you grew up in, and the outcomes and the access that you have. So we want to break that in the interests of those young people, in the interests of the economy and the kind of society we want to build, in the interests of creating more opportunities and more potential, so that we can all be more successful.
Yeah, and it's that economic angle, I think, is one that's really useful if organisations are at the start of their social mobility journey here. There are something like 9 million economically inactive people in the UK, some of which are for very legitimate reasons, who can't work for certain reasons. But when we're looking at where is opportunity to move into well-paid jobs, essentially well-paid employment, the tech industry has a lot to offer here. And our kind of like tech talent shortages are costing an estimated 63 billion in lost GDP. So there is this really nice opportunity here that if we can support people who want these economic opportunities into these gaps that we've got, that is a win-win for everyone, and that's a rare and wonderful situation to be in. So it's a great place for us to be starting, is looking at how we can bring these two things together. So I'd love to ask a first quick question to you, Sarah. We've used a couple of different terms here, and if an organisation is quite new to this, I just would love to cover quickly social mobility and socio-economic diversity. Could you just help explain how they're different and what the link is?
Yes. So socio-economic background is something objective that we can measure. Everybody's got a socioeconomic background. We're all, to a huge extent, a kind of product of our socioeconomic background, which in the UK, the measures that we look at to measure your socioeconomic background are when you're about 14, so old enough to know and be able to answer the question, but young enough that it was influential in shaping you. What were your parents doing? What was the main breadwinner in your household doing for a job? And we can kind of categorize that by different levels of job. We also look at what kind of school did you go to? Was it a paying school? Was it a selective school? Was it a state school? And often as a nuance, we also look at whether you're eligible for free school meals in the UK. And that gives you the shape of someone's socioeconomic background, the extent to which they've had in their early years, access to privilege, opportunity and networks or not. And those things are really good, well-established measures. They're objective, we can measure them, we can track them, we can compare them. They're good data points to collect. Socioeconomic diversity is about having a range of different socioeconomic backgrounds, perspectives and experiences in your organisation. And although, of course, every aspect of diversity works differently, has different kind of elements to it, and when we talk about human beings, it has all sorts of complexity and human nuance to it. It's also really important that we have a diversity of socioeconomic background along with other characteristics in our decisions and in the room. And social mobility is about the connection. So if a country has, as the UK does, low social mobility, it means that your outcomes are really strongly defined by your socioeconomic background. We can really track that. And unfortunately, in the UK, in the economy, and in every sector of the economy, we really can track that. There's a really strong connection. We've also grabbed the name of social mobility to describe the kind of work that we're doing to support and influence socioeconomic diversity. So you'll often hear organisations talk about having a social mobility strategy or wanting to do social mobility work. And that's about saying what we want to do is strengthen opportunities and try and start to break and unpick that link.
Thank you for that, because that's really useful to understand that there's this goal of measuring socioeconomic diversity and socioeconomic background, but actually what we're really trying to get to is improving social mobility as that kind of that movement, really. And actually that's a really good place for us to start with this tech lens specifically. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, I get why we would talk about social mobility from the point of view of maybe something like law or finance, where there is potentially a more of a well-recognized view that maybe background is an influencer of how successful someone is in a certain field. Surely tech doesn't have that problem.
Yeah, so tech, of course, as you described, Lexi, has a huge amount to offer and ought to be fantastic for social mobility. What matters more in tech? The way someone dresses or speaks, someone having a beautiful three-piece suit and lovely shiny polished shoes, someone having a very plummy accent, or their ability to solve problems, their design thinking, their ability to kind of analyze and cut through to identify solutions. And yet we know that the profile of jobs in the tech industry, and particularly when we look at more senior and decision-making levels, looks pretty similar to the socioeconomic profile of sectors like law, finance, journalism. As you get into organizations, it is predominantly people from professional backgrounds. Even if a professional background is not necessary or professional qualifications are not necessary, it's predominantly people from professional backgrounds getting in. And as you go further up organizations into more senior decision-making levels, that becomes more acute. We also know that young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds don't think of the tech industry as welcoming. 20% of our students who are, let me remind you, super talented young people full of potential, but coming from working class backgrounds, only 19% of them think that the tech industry is a place that they could work or is going to be welcoming for them. So
that's interesting to hear from like a digital native generation.
Yeah, and as you say, given that you want talent and you want problem solving, design thinking, analytical skills, and you want them where they are best and most able, regardless of someone's background, that is a problem for the tech industry. It's stopping you from achieving your goals and being able to do your work better.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the next logical question here is, why is there this misalignment in the perception of how tech should and could be, and where it actually is? Like, why does that stereotype persist? What, that's going to help us unpick what we can do about it.
Yeah, so one thing that we always look at across the piece is the sort of the hard barriers and the kind of soft or insidious barriers that an industry might be experiencing. So say in tech, the hard barriers that often exist around qualifications. In law, for example, you have to have a university degree for many routes into law, and there's a preference for people who've got really top qualifications, top A-levels and top degrees. That doesn't really play out in most tech jobs. Very few tech jobs and entrants are required to have particular qualifications. But there are hard barriers that come into play around money and finance. So access to tech, whether young people have had opportunities with technology, if you are expected to be able to bring your laptop to an interview or be able to show tech work that you've already done. Actually, there's financial barriers around that kind of access that can cause a problem. There's also hard barriers to do with finance around geographic mobility. Can you get interviews or assessment centres or hackathons or whatever your selection processes are? Can you move and be flexible to follow where jobs are? There's recruitment pathways. Always we look at any ways in. How would you find out about it? How would you access it? How would you know what's expected of you? And young people who don't have a network, who don't have people who can advise them, already working connections with people already working in the industry, who haven't had experience, they lack some of those roots in, and they also may lack some of the knowledge about how to follow the pathway, how to play the game. So those are some of the sort of trickier, hard barriers, and they can persist, of course. It's not just about early careers. Even very senior people who come from working class backgrounds may have different geographic mobility, different challenges in terms of kind of family that they're supporting. So the financial barriers and financial challenges can still play out even when you get more senior. I think also when you look at people getting on in organisations, actually all sectors and parts of the economy where there's really clear ways that you progress can sometimes be better for social mobility than slightly more ambiguous, slightly more chaotic environments where you do well, you get involved in projects, you get stuck in, and you grow your capability and you get seen by people. That can really be challenging to spot talent when it maybe presents as differently, speaks with a different voice, speaks with less confidence. So welcoming environments are not always the ones that are the most casual and relaxed. Sometimes they're the ones that are really kind of clear about what's going on and what you have to do.
So there's this concept of technology capital, which anyone who's working in this area is going to know about, right? It's that idea of like, you can have social capital, but technology capital is like, what is your understanding of the sector? Like, how do you know how it works? And a lot of the way you cultivate technology capital, which is correlated with access to tech opportunity, is this idea of do you know people? Do you have a network? Do you know, do you have family or friends who work in the tech sector? And you were talking about this localized idea here, that when we have so much of our technology like infrastructure and firms and businesses all located in certain areas, that means that anything that's going on outside of those areas is just way more important for making sure that we're reaching social mobility cold spots and helping people find ways to build that technology capital, so that we can try and support these inroads, not just at the junior level, but as you were saying, like that factors into senior diversity as well, and diversity of thought, so that this is right across the talent pipeline, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I guess this is a good moment for us to have a talk about measurement then. So we've kind of broadly gone, we've got a problem with this, there are some ways that we can look at it, what we need to do to actually get there. And the first thing that Tech Talent Charter will always tell any organizations is, you've got to get a good data strategy in place, you've got to start measuring things. Yeah. So I would love you to talk us through, like, if you're starting from a blank piece of paper, or even if you're not, what should we be doing to measure socio-economic diversity and be looking at what we can then do next?
Yeah. So I talked about these objective measures that we look at, and the one absolutely key data point that enables you to get a picture of where you are now, to track change, and also to benchmark and compare is parental occupation at age 14 that I talked about. It's the best single measure to assess someone's socioeconomic background. It's easy to understand. It gets good response rates in testing. It's applicable. Actually, it's applicable if you have a global workforce. It works outside of the UK, which some other aspects of measures don't. So it is a simple and straightforward measure, and it is now quite widely collected in in lots of sectors and businesses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing you were just saying about the global view, because that's something that I know I've heard from organisations that Tech Talent Charter speak to, of going, well, how can we measure socioeconomic background? That's surely a very UK-centric thing. And actually what they're thinking of in their minds is that there are usually 4 questions that are recommended by the Social Mobility Commission. And what's really interesting about the one that you've highlighted as the one question that if you can only ask one thing, that's what you ask, is parental occupation at 14, that you were saying does translate really well globally. So actually organisations who are having that concern of, we have a global workforce, how do we centralise things, that is the question to ask that transcends internationally.
That's right. That's one of the reasons that it's the key data point. Also, it's a key data point that we can benchmark with globally as well as within the economy.
So in terms of if you're looking to where to find those questions, I just mentioned that the Social Mobility Commission has this toolkit online, and that's where you can find not only this question, but also it has a really useful toolkit which has a matrix that helps you interpret what those questions mean. So if you were to ask that question to your workforce, or any of the other 3 options that tell you different that speak to different facets of socioeconomic background, it gives you that matrix to then go, well, I've got these responses, what does that mean? So it's a fantastic resource if organisations are looking to start with asking those questions, because one of the big things is, of course, you collect the data, but then what does this mean, and how can I interpret it? So making use of what's already there, it's a brilliant resource that's regularly updated. That would be a great place to start. So I guess the other thing that I often get asked about these questions, and I know you and I have talked about it before, Sarah, is this idea of, you know, there are shortcomings with this question. There are organisations that will have asked it before, not had good responses from their employees. Their employees have had comments about it that are you know, they don't feel comfortable with it. You know, we've had comments coming back from organisations who say, oh, my employees are asking me, why are you asking this? Why is this relevant? You know, surely there are problems with asking this one question. How can you tell my whole background about me from this one thing? So, you know, when looking at data, we are making categorizations, and we're trying to look for a best fit to find out what we want to find out. But can you help us understand a bit more about what are the shortcomings and challenges with this question, and how can we start to orient ourselves and position this question in a way that is authentic but recognizes shortcomings if we're going to position it to employees?
That's right. I mean, I think the first thing in terms of shortcomings is you're right. It's sort of a nonsense to boil people down to one piece of data on their socioeconomic background, in just the same way that boiling people down to one piece of data on any other aspect of the human condition, your ethnicity, your gender, can often, you know, you think, I'm so much more than that, and I'm so much more complex than that. It's also, parental occupation misses some of the other things that can play out around things like educational opportunities, status, some of the kind of human factors that relate to things like class identity, which can be a really important part of the human conversation. If you want to have a conversation with your colleagues about how welcoming an environment is or not, how decisions get made, you know, you probably want to have a more nuanced human conversation, the one that just says everybody fits into a 3-box grid.
Yeah. It is that thing of that person-centric approach, and this is a starting point for that. So a lot of the time I think there's a lot of nervousness about positioning this survey question because it's less well understood, it's less obvious in our common parlance of what we talk about when we think about diversity and inclusion. Everyone can talk about the idea of women in tech. That makes complete sense. It's really accessible, but this isn't quite so accessible, and that can result sometimes in organisations being a bit hesitant to have a dialogue around these topics because there isn't confidence about understanding how they work. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask about some of those challenges, and the fact that it's okay to say this is just one facet, one way for us to start understanding the picture. So, I mean, with that in mind, I guess the question is, if you're going to have a conversation about this, how might you start to position this data collection piece with your employees? Like, what are the key things you need to hit at? You know, what do we need to be saying to them to persuade them to share information about themselves, which is not a protected characteristic, which is hard to understand why it links to your organization's broader diversity and inclusion practice? How do we message that?
Yeah. So this is really important, and it's not necessarily data that people have been asked for before. And exactly as you say, although it's becoming increasingly more common for organisations to collect this data and it's well benchmarked, you certainly can't take it as read either that people will understand or agree with the measure without a bit of conversation, or that they will necessarily trust you with that information. You know, in all our aspects of diversity, we're used to the fact that if you want people to share something about themselves, they have to trust that good things are going to result, that change is going to come, that's beneficial change, that you're going to protect that information and there's going to be privacy around it, and who's going to have access to it and what are they going to do with it. So in many ways, socio-economic background isn't different from some of the conversations that we had to have in time gone past about people disclosing their sexuality, for example. I'm feeling confident in work that that's not going to be held against them. That's not going to be information that's going to be treated disrespectfully, and that as a result, better things are going to come in terms of organisational strategy. So it's similar thinking, it's similar storytelling, and it's also being really clear about the intent. What's going to happen as a result of this? What as an organisation are you expecting to do? I think it is important to show that this is a widely respected benchmark as well.
Yeah. And there's something that you and I talked about before around this idea of you know, understanding the sensitivity to this question. And it's actually, particularly for organisations that are more mature in the diversity and inclusion practice, they've tend to have cultivated more of a psychological safety, a trusting environment, an environment that prioritises empathy. And that's really important to look at these questions from that angle, isn't it? Because it's that idea that by asking about socioeconomic background, you could be potentially poking at stuff that is really very triggering and could be reminding people of trauma from their past that is difficult to deal with. And I know some organisations we work with are now starting to focus in on this idea of how do we support individuals who have experienced trauma, who are experiencing trauma. How do we support them in the workplace? And actually, socioeconomic background is tied to that, isn't it? That idea of potentially triggering like past trauma, and the way that we ask these questions has to take into account that there is a whole wealth of richness that is associated with this question. And actually, when we spoke, didn't we, it was that idea that if you could only ask one thing, that question about parental occupation at 14 can be really helpful, because by asking that one question, you're also protecting your employees who might not be used to this by giving them quite a neutral question that they can respond to, that doesn't dig into necessarily or kind of trigger some of those potential experiences. Because obviously the individuals who have come from those less privileged backgrounds are likely to be the ones who are more likely to be impacted by the experience of answering the question. And I found that fascinating as an idea of like what is the safety of the survey.
That's exactly right. If you think about free school meal eligibility, for example, which is can be a really important data point in the UK, there are plenty of families who don't claim the free school meals they're eligible for because of the stigma. So people in poverty won't have the free food at school because it has a stigma attached to it. If you understand that, then you understand why asking someone who's worked hard and overcome barriers and got into a professional environment, or who's applying for a competitive job in your organisation, why they might be reluctant to tell you that they were eligible for free school meals as a child, or why, in more sort of human and whole person conversations, talking about what growing up in an environment of poverty, what those barriers represented, what things that you weren't able to do. This can absolutely be, it's very human, it can be very triggering. People can be enormously proud, rightly so, of their achievements and having overcome those barriers, but also this can be quite painful, quite difficult. Nobody wants to be seen and defined purely by their background any more than we want to be seen and defined purely by any other aspect of our characteristics, and particularly whether your own relationship with your background might be quite complicated. You might feel a complicated mixture of pride, embarrassment, a sense that it's who shaped you and where you've come from, but also a sense that you are more than the sum of your parts. It's a complex piece.
Yeah, and complexity, I think, is a really important word for us to look at. And we're going to move on to the actionable bit in a second. But when we talk about the complexity here of social mobility, this layers over so many other areas of diversity and inclusion practice. So obviously, Tech Talent Charter, we work with the organisations that are really forward-thinking and leaning into this diversity and inclusion work, and they understand why it's important. But there are some organisations out there that might be going, well, why do I need to care about this? Why, ultimately, I worked hard and I got here. So, there's that kind of old-fashioned, outdated attitude that still persists. But actually, when we're looking at socio-economic background and we're looking at social mobility, this overlays with so many of those areas. And by talking about trauma, that's quite an interesting one, because it does intersect with other protected characteristics that very much are governance issues for organisations that they need to take very seriously. So, we're looking at, for instance, socio-economic background and race. That's a really clear intersection that needs to be looked at, because there are these lines that cross between different lenses of diversity and inclusion practice that do make this fall under certain Equality Act characteristics, depending on how you look at that picture. And I was just thinking, with this trauma piece, we're looking at and the kind of being triggered at work, there are so many other lenses, and a couple that spring to my mind are things like neurodivergence and disability. Those can overlay really closely with experiences of trauma and how that manifests for an individual and how they experience that in the workplace.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think one thing as well, Lexi, for people to think about, as well as the barriers or the painful complexity that will overlap and intersect between social mobility and other characteristics, there's also a really important conversation about the positive values and attributes and the overlap there. We all know that it's important not just to talk about the barriers that people of colour face in work, for example, but also to celebrate their contribution, their achievement, what they bring to an organisation. And when we talk about social mobility, it's really important as well, not just to talk about the things that the young people that we work with lack, knowledge, networks, kind of access. We also want to talk about the things that they bring: plain speaking, cost consciousness, grit and hustle, enormous resilience and determination. These are things that every workplace wants and wants to access. But also in celebrating working class values and capabilities, we can see the overlap between working class communities and immigrant communities, for example, and celebrate some of those. So it can be a really powerful route into a whole person conversation through social mobility, both from a support and trauma informed perspective, but also from a perspective of celebration and contribution.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful place for us to finish this bit of the conversation, because you're absolutely right. Like, at the end of the day, we are talking about a hugely talented, hugely rich set of input that we want to be pulling into our organisations, because we know it's going to make better products, it's going to please customers more, it's going to result in better productivity. There is just a win-win here for everyone. So on that note, then, I guess let's talk about what we should be doing. So, like, you've collected some data, and we're hoping to see in the next year, as we go to our next diversity and inclusion survey from Tech Talent Charter's point of view this summer, we saw last year that only it was between 30 and 40% of signatories are collecting socio-economic background data. So we want to see that go up. We want to see organisations engaging a lot more with this whole area of practice. So let's say they're collecting this data. What do they do? What are some things that they can start with? And I would love to also get you to speak to what could this look like for small organisations who don't have deep pockets, because that is something we hear often is, I don't have enough money to work on this. This is too much for me. So where can organisations start? And if they've already started, where should they be looking to next?
Yeah. So starting with the data first. So we're collecting this socio-economic background data. Brilliant. Set yourself a target for response rates. because we've talked about how important it is as a measure of confidence and engagement in the strategy that people are willing to give you this information. So set yourself a target for improving the collection of that data, and then start to work towards the point where you're benchmarking for your sector or against other industries, and start to get to the point you're setting yourself a target. So that's the data piece. However you recruit as an organisation, take a look at your recruitment processes. Take a look at the data and what that's telling you about where in your organisation you may have different patterns or different balances. Take a look at that, and that may give you a focus. Retention, so back office, for example, often has better socio-economic diversity than some of your client-facing or some of your kind of front-end pieces. So take a look at that and think about how you recruit in and what kind of approaches are working or are making it more difficult.
We have a question that comes up sometimes, this idea of what should I be making my first metric? So if socioeconomic background is something you're collecting for the first time, what should you set as your benchmark? And that was something that we were speaking about a bit earlier. So with the idea of a benchmark, when I spoke to Sarah about this earlier, it was the idea that your very first metric should be your disclosure rate. So if you're not sure where to start making that benchmark line up, the very first thing that you should be looking at is how many people are comfortable sharing this information with me. So if this is your first foray into this area of practice, disclosure is a really, really good area that you can start looking at. What is the trust level? How do people feel talking about this? And that is a completely legitimate place to start. You don't have to necessarily set a target of we're going to change from X to Y in a certain amount of time. It can just be, what is the disclosure rate and how do we get that to a level that we feel is acceptable and in line with potentially other metrics we have in the organisation.
The next thing to look at, again, however big or small an organisation you are, is a social mobility conversation. You know, in a big organisation, that might look like a social mobility network with a senior sponsor. In a small organisation, that might look like getting everyone in the organisation around a table and saying, look, we're all a product of our backgrounds. We've all had privileges, help and support, and we've all had things that got in the way from our backgrounds, barriers and difficulties. Let's talk about what that looks like in this organisation, what ideas we've got about how to make it more inclusive. Now, that normalizing that conversation, which comes from leaders, can really bring out some insights into the things that make your organization either powerful or is holding you back.
So I guess you've talked about, like, we're talking about a strategy lens there, like going to the leadership and you know, looking at how you're going to prioritize this. But I would love to understand, is that the same if you're a small organization? Like, I mean, let's say you have like single figures of employees. That's not necessarily going to be, you might be the person who is listening to this and going, right, I've decided I'm going to do this and I'm the only person that needs to take action on this. So what does this look like in a really small organisation? Because I'm sure Social Mobility Foundation work with plenty of them, and I'm sure that there are also large organisations that are going to end up having these conversations with their suppliers to help them come on a journey if this is something that's a priority at your organisation and you have a degree of influence over a supply chain. So what can this look like for a small organisation?
Okay, brilliantly you've talked about supply chain, and that is definitely important. Even if you are an organisation of a tiny number of people, if you are spending money and you're interested in supporting and enabling social mobility, thinking about how the money that you spend will enable a kind of broader talent pipeline, better skills and access. You know, that is something that that's a question you can put to your suppliers and a challenge that you can set. And often that's where real power lies. We've seen that with all sorts of organisations that we've worked with at SMF, where putting those kind of requirements and expectations into suppliers has been really powerful. You talked about, again, sort of very small organisations, thinking about how people get into your organisation and how people can or would access the kind of skills and the kind of knowledge that enables you to get in, enables you to start thinking about how you can, as anyone who's interested in this in any organisation at any level, how you can start to be a mentor, a sponsor, a supporter, a leader for social mobility. Everybody can support informally or through a structured scheme, whether it's like a charity like ours or something in a structured organisation. Everybody has got knowledge and experience that they've gained. No one was born knowing how to be senior in the tech industry. No one was born knowing how to operate in your workplace. You've accrued that knowledge, and that kind of knowledge, that kind of insight and a bit of a helping hand can be really, really powerful, because everybody who's talented and able needs access to that to be able to get in and get on. So think about those sorts of connections, that sort of knowledge that you might be able to share, and also think about, how do people get into your organisation? What really challenge yourself on what barriers, financial, social capital, technology capital, what things are getting in the way of you being able to see the talent and the strengths that you need, and really challenge yourselves on that. Because again, whether you're an organisation of 3 people or thousands and thousands of people, how people get in and the access and the barriers is a really important place to look with the social mobility lens.
And so I guess from a supply chain point of view, that's extra important, because if you are able to influence small businesses, they are going to reach people that you may not be able to reach yourself because of who you are and your expectations and your requirements for your team. So actually, with that idea of technology capital, it's not like a plan B, it's plan A, that you need to get those organizations to engage with people that you would not otherwise be engaging with, for all the reasons why there are strengths within SMEs, the things that people like about working for SMEs. There are benefits to working for large organizations and small, and by reaching and influencing across the supply chain, you're going to be able to get technology capital and kind of break down barriers for a much wider spread of people. And that's the whole point of socio-mobility as a practice, isn't it? So I mean, I guess let's go into a little bit more some of the scenarios and actions that folks can take. So if we go to like grassroots level, people who are executing on social mobility plans, what are they doing? What are the things that need to be core practice in social mobility plans? And I'd love to hear this from the point of view of like, what should HR be doing? What should their desk look like with this kind of thing?
Okay, so HR absolutely can be, they can be the holders of the data and the benchmarks for sure, and they making sure again that the intersection of social mobility with the other things that are important in your organisation and your strategy, that's something that HR will always have a really great lens on. And the connection to kind of what are your people talent and skills challenges, and how do you make sure that this is really serving that. I think HR as well can play such an important part in that that look at the roots in and the roots on. So one really important thing, we talked a bit about social capital. We talked a bit about the sort of behaviours that are associated with being a bit more privileged and having a good network, networks, confidence, the ways that people approach kind of new and challenging environments, and all the things that are associated with coming from a more privileged background. HR can really look at what does talent and what does high performance look like. Again, this might be a big framework piece in a big organisation, or this might be just something that says, what do we reward here? What kind of behaviour do we reward? What kind of success do we look for? What does a successful person look like in our organisation? And that's a really important lens to think about social mobility, because that's a really important lens to think about. Are you looking at potential? Are you looking at strengths? Are you thinking about those values that we talked about, the plain speaking, the determination, the kind of problem solving? Or are you kind of expecting it to come from a particular place or be presented in a particular package? So I think that kind of what does talent look like? What does potential look like? And what are we expecting people to bring? I think that's such an important conversation for HR to lead. Some organisations that are doing this really well have really rethought what talent looks like. What things are we using as proxies for people who are going to be really good? And are they linked to performance, really? In big law, this looks like 2-1 degrees from Russell Group universities. Does that really give us high-performing individuals or not? In medicine, it's involved looking at, is the person with the best academic capability necessarily the person who's going to make the best doctor and the best patient-led practitioner. In engineering, it's looking at problem-solving capabilities and ways to understand that you can then teach the sort of technical and professional capabilities around it, because you've got that understanding. So yeah, really looking at kind of what does best for the job look like in our organization, in our sector. And I think in tech, you've got such exciting challenges and societal problems that you want to solve that no one knows the answers to yet. So different thinking, different experience and different perspectives, could be really exciting in terms of your kind of HR, workforce and development strategies. This really isn't just a nice to have. This really feels like accessing what you need and what we as an economy need the tech industry to have to do.
That is a beautiful note for us to end on. So I'm just going to give you one question for us to both speak to, really, which is what are some things you can do straight off the back of this call that will help with continuing your practice in this area? So Social Mobility Foundation, lay it down. What are the things that people need to be doing off the back of this conversation?
So we would love you to take a look at the Social Mobility Employer Index. It's our key tool for employers to get an understanding of where you are, even if you're right at the absolute beginning, the absolute base camp, you don't think you're doing anything on social mobility. Get involved in the index, get some advice and support from us and a diagnostic on where you might want to focus your efforts. Be part of our index community as well, so that you are an employer who says social mobility is important and serious to us. We're going to fly the flag. We would love you to do that, and in return we can promise you, some help, some advice, some useful pointers on what you're doing well already and what you need to do more of. And if you think you might be an organisation that can get involved with us as a charity in terms of offering opportunities to some of the brilliant young people that we work with, who don't think the tech industry is for them, but who have, I promise you, all the talent and capability that you could possibly want, then tap us up for that as well, because we've got 2,000 young people keen and hungry to have successful careers, and they might be the people you want.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Sarah. And from Tech Talent Charter's point of view, we've got a next session coming up on accent bias, which is very much linked to this one. We were talking about those ideas of what are some of the things that you might be judging candidates on when you shouldn't be. Accent bias is a really interesting area, so we've got that coming up, so you can check out our events if you would like to have a look at that one. And the other thing is that we've got our roadshow in Edinburgh coming up on May 16th as well, which has a focus on socio-economic background and social mobility. So if you know any organisations in that area, or you are based in that area, we would love you to be part of the conversation, because we will be bringing together leaders from the tech and the business space in Scotland to discuss this and find out what they're doing to try and improve social mobility within their organisations. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us for our session. Thank you so much, Sarah Atkinson, for joining us and sharing your expertise from Social Mobility Foundation. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in and pop them on the chat.